Happy New Year, everyone. And welcome to today's highly anticipated talk by Jean. My name's Abby Chen. I'm the head of Contemporary Art Department at the Asian Art Museum, also the curator of downstairs Konki Warring State Cyberpunk, an exhibition about Asian futurism through comic, anime, sci-fi, and antiquity, inquiring humans' relationship with universe and technology. I want to give a shout out to the artist Konki here, who is joining us today too as a fan of Jean. It is with great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jean, even though he doesn't need further introduction. Someone I greatly admire. Jean, I don't know if you remember, we first communicated through email back in 2008 when I was still working at Chinese Culture Center. As a first-generation immigrant who came to US as an adult, your American-born Chinese was such a friendly and empathetic companion for my younger self, feeling both empowered and alienated then, trying to make sense of her new reality. So thank you, Jean. This is from me personally. We're honored to be here with Jean, an American cartoonist, a teacher of computer science. In 2016, the US Library of Congress named him Ambassador for Young People's Literature. In the same year, he received the MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Award. It was back in 2006 Yang published American-Born Chinese, drawing upon the Chinese folk legend character Monkey King. The book tells the story of a school-age second-generation immigrant who struggled with his Chinese-American identity. In 2021, Disney ordered the production of a television adaptation of the book. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that in a bit, and huge congratulations, Jin, for that. As a teacher of computer science, he used cartoon for his class and was very well received by his students. And I wonder how come I was never in a class like that. Making his Marvel comic debut in 2020, Jin wrote a miniseries starring the martial arts superhero Shang-Chi. The series explores the relationship between Shang-Chi and his father Zhang Zu, who was originally the infamous villain Fu Manchu. In 2018, Yang joined the board of directors of Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization founded in 1986, chartered to protect the First Amendment rights of the comic community. Here at the Asian Art Museum, with the launch of the show by Konki's exhibition and today's talk with Jin, I hope we will build a hub for Asian and Asian American cartoonists and comic artists. So let's consider this a beginning to kick off that efforts. And now let's hear from the artist himself and welcome Jim to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know the weather is not the best, so you really braved some rain to be here, and it really is an honor. My name is Jean. This is what I look like in real life. That's what I look like as a cartoon. And I am an Asian American cartoonist. I'm sure you can tell from looking at me that I'm Asian American. Being a cartoonist means I get to write and draw comic books for a living. I've been doing this for over 20 years now. Here are some of the books that I've worked on in these last 20 years. Some of these books, I do both the writing and the art, and others, I only handle the writing, and I get to work with these amazing artists who actually execute it on the page. On this slide right here, the books at the top of the screen are ones where I did both the writing and the art, and the ones at the bottom are collaborations, where I worked with other artists. Now, I'd like to start my talk today with this book right here. Dragon Hoops is my most recent graphic novel. Thank you. This is my most recent graphic novel where I wrote and drew everything. It was colored by a good friend of mine named Lark Pien, absolutely amazingly talented artist who graciously agreed to color my book. And I'm sure you can tell from this cover that it's about basketball. I have to tell you, if you had told me when I was like in 7th grade that I would spend 5 years of my life writing and drawing a book about basketball, I would not have believed you, because when I was a kid, I hated basketball. This is how most basketball games would go for me. I just had a really hard time paying attention to where the ball was. It was just completely uninteresting to me. And as a result, I would almost always get hurt. I'd either get my fingers jammed, or I'd get a ball to the head, or I'd get my feelings hurt because one of the other players would say something really mean to me. So pretty early on, I learned to put up this wall in between me and basketball, just to keep my fingers from getting jammed and my feelings from getting hurt. And those of you who are adults know that, when we become adults, those walls that we put up when we're kids, they tend to stay with us. This is even true of teachers. So I was a high school teacher for 17 years. This is where I taught. Anyone recognize this place? This is Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, the premier high school in the Bay Area, in my opinion. I taught computer science there for 17 years. The school is mostly known for its athletics program. It has amazing football, basketball, and volleyball teams. As a computer science teacher, I had literally nothing to do with any of those teams. Here's what it looks like as a cartoon. And here is a cartoon of what the faculty lunchroom looked like. So in that faculty lunchroom, all the PE teachers would sit at one table. All of the drama teachers would sit at another table, and then all of the nerdy teachers would sit at another table. To be fair, there were some teachers that would move from one table to the next, but most of us, we stayed where we were most comfortable. We stayed inside of our walls. Every now and then, though, something might happen in your life that will get you to move outside of your walls, and for me, it was basketball. About 7 or 8 years ago, basketball started to invade my life. This thing that I hated ever since I was a kid started just weasel its way into my time. First, it came through my son. So I have a son, he is 19 now, he's a sophomore in college, but when he was in 5th grade, he joined his school's basketball team. So I had to start going to these basketball games. I had to start watching these games where I didn't really get what the rules were. Second, around that same time, a guy named Jeremy Lin burst onto the scene of the NBA. Jeremy Lin and I, we grew up in almost the same area. And we're also Asian American, but that's kind of where the similarities end. Even so, those two similarities, the fact that he grew up where I grew up and he came from the same cultural heritage, got me to start watching NBA games. And I couldn't totally understand why I was so interested. And finally, as an author, books will pop up on my radar every now and then. And these books about basketball started popping up. The most prominent of which is probably the one with the white cover. It's called Crossover by Kwame Alexander. It ended up winning the Newbery Award, which is the top honor that a children's book can get in America. The most remarkable thing about that book is that Kwame, and I get to call him Kwame because we're friends, Kwame is able to capture the rhythm of a game of basketball using the rhythm of his words. So basketball just was entering into my life. I think the most prominent of these invasions of basketball, though, happened on that Bishop O'Dowd campus. At the beginning of the 2014-2015 school year, everybody on campus was talking about basketball. All the teachers, all the students, all the staff, and specifically, they were all super excited about the varsity men's team that year. Eventually, all that talk really got to me. So I had to find out what all the excitement was about. So I found this guy right here. His name is Lou Ritchie. He is a PE teacher at Bishop O'Dowd. He is also the coach of the varsity men's team. This is what he looks like in the Bishop O'Dowd yearbook. Here is what he looks like as a cartoon. Now, Lou and I, we had actually been teaching on the same campus for over a decade, but we were not really friends. We weren't really friends because he sat with the PE teachers and I sat with the nerdy teachers. Lou is an athlete and I'm a nerd. We're not really supposed to mix. But as I sat down with him and as I started asking him about what everybody was talking about, as he started answering all of my newbie basketball questions, we slowly did become friends. He invited me to go and watch his team play, so I went. First to one game, and then to another, and then to another, and pretty soon I found myself following Lou's team over an entire season. Over that season, I got to know Lou, I got to know his fellow coaches, I got to know his players, and I got to know the game of basketball. These days, I do consider myself a basketball fan. I am not an expert. I'm really glad that those two things are not the same. I'm not an expert. There'll still be some times when I'm watching an NBA game and all the action will stop and I will have no idea why. But at least I understand the thrill of the sport. I get why people love it so much. And I also understand its importance in the place of American history. That season, I got to know Lou pretty well, and what I discovered was that he and I are not as different as I had originally assumed. So first, just like me, Lou loves books. He loves especially reading books about world history. Lou also loves numbers. When he was a kid, he had so many sports statistics memorized in his head that the other kids in his neighborhood would all call him the professor. So Lou is not just an athlete. He is also a nerd. He's like this hybrid, right? He's like a nerdly. And I have photographic evidence of this. This is what Lou looked like when he was a kid. Not that different from what I look like. So over the course of that season, I follow the Bishop O'Dowd Dragons. We go all over the country. We go to Florida and Missouri and LA to play in these tournaments. I get to listen in on their pep talks and their strategy sessions. And I got to know this story. This was an amazing story about a team of coaches and players all chasing after the same goal. They all wanted the California State Championship. And this story was so compelling to me that I ended up devoting 5 years of my life writing and drawing a book about it. So that's what Dragon Hoops is all about. It is about the 2014-2015 Bishop O'Dowd Dragons and their chase after the California State Championship. This whole story actually begins with Lou. Lou is one of the most interesting people I've ever met in real life. Lou isn't just a PE teacher and a basketball coach at Bishop O'Dowd. He is also an alum. He went to Bishop O'Dowd in the 80s. He graduated in 1989. He was part of the varsity men's team as well. And when he was a junior, his team made it all the way to the California State Championships. Back then, that game was played in the Oakland Arena, which we now know as the Oracle Arena, up until recently, the home of the Golden State Warriors. Biggest game of Lou Richie's life. He is the backup point guard, but for whatever reason, in the closing seconds of the game, he is on the court. Bishop O'Dowd is down by 1, and somehow the ball makes it into Lou's hands, and he dribbles down the court as fast as he can. He puts it up at the buzzer, and miracle of miracles, it actually goes through the hoop. So Bishop O'Dowd wins by 1. They win the California State Championship by 1 point. Lou is jumping up and down on the court, screaming. His teammates all rush him. His coach comes out. They're yelling and laughing. And then over the intercom comes the ref's whistle. The ref invalidates that shot, the biggest shot of young Lou Richie's life. And they invalidate it because supposedly Mike Dones, the center of the Bishop O'Dowd Dragons, had his hand on the rim as the ball was falling through the hoop. So it was offensive goaltending. Lou is telling me this story in his office. He's like a 40-something-year-old guy. And you could see the emotion rising in his face as he's telling it, right? And then when he's finished with the story, he reaches over his desk and he grabs a DVD of that championship game from the 1980s. And he hands it to me, he goes, Yang, you take this home and you watch it. And you tell me if that kid's hand was on the rim. So I did. I took it home and I watched it, and I have to tell you, it's hard to tell. That was a very, very controversial call. Very controversial. Lou doesn't forget about that shot. He does not forget about that 1-point loss. He does not forget about the invalidation of the ref. The next year, his team makes another push for the California State Championship. They fall short. Lou goes on to play in college, first at UCLA, and then at Clemson, and then a hamstring injury ends his career. He eventually makes his way back to Bishop O'Dowd, first as an assistant coach to his old head coach, and then as the head coach himself. He becomes the first African-American head coach in the school's history. Now, as an assistant coach and as a head coach, Lou Richie led 5 teams to the California State Championship. He had 5 chances to redeem that old hurt that he had sustained when he was 17 years old. He lost all 5 times. One of the reasons why I became so interested in the Bishop O'Dowd Dragons during the 2014-2015 school year is because they had these 2 kids on their team. This is Ivan Rabb and Paris Austin. They were maybe the most talented players that had come through Bishop O'Dowd's men program in a generation. And because of these 2 kids, here's what they look like in the book. Supposedly, 2014-2015 was Coach Lou Richie's best chance at finally redeeming that old hurt from when he was 17 years old. I wanted to see if he could do it. I'm not going to tell you if he did or not, because I want you to read the book. But I will say this, as I got to know Lou Richie, one of the things we talked about in his office one day was his major. He chose to major in history because he loved it so much. And I asked him why. I said, why choose to major in that? That's not something that my parents would have let me major in. But why would you major in that? And he said this. He said something pretty profound, I think. He said, you have to know your past if you want to create a future. You have to know your past if you want to create a future. I was talking to the museum about this talk before I got here, and they talked to me about Conke's work, and they talked about how Conke, you got to go check it out downstairs. It's absolutely mind-blowing and inspirational. But what he does is he really does embody this statement. He uses the past to inform the future. And I think this idea, articulated by Coach Lou, informs a lot of my own work as well, even though I probably wouldn't have said it this way. When I think about some of my graphic novels, I can see this idea underneath. So I'd like to take you through 2 of my different works and tell you how they kind of do this, how this idea informs those graphic novels. So let's start with this one right here. Boxers and Saints is a 2-volume graphic novel that was published in 2012 by First Second Books, the same publisher of Dragon Hoops. It was written and drawn by me, colored also by Lark Pien, the same artist who colored Dragon Hoops. And this is a 2-volume graphic novel all about the Boxer Rebellion, which is a war that was fought on Chinese soil in the year 1900. I first got interested in the Boxer Rebellion in the year 2000. That year, Pope John Paul II canonized 120 Chinese Catholic saints. I grew up in a Chinese Catholic community. We met right here. This is St. Clare's Church in Santa Clara. And my home church kind of freaked out about it. Like when the Pope made his announcement, they had all these special masses and giant celebrations. There was all this food everywhere. Giant trays of egg rolls were everywhere. Anytime you see giant trays of egg rolls everywhere, Chinese people are really happy about something. So these festivities inspired me to look into the lives of these newly canonized saints. And what I discovered was that many of them had been martyred. They'd been killed during the Boxer Rebellion. And they were killed because back then, if you were of Chinese descent and you embraced a Western faith, like any form of Christianity, you were seen as somebody who betrayed your own people, who betrayed your culture, who betrayed your nation. In fact, shortly after the Pope made his announcement, the government of China issued a letter of protest saying that the Roman Catholic Church was honoring these traitors to the Chinese people. The more I read about the Boxer Rebellion, the more I felt like this historical conflict mirrored a conflict that I had felt between East and West in my own life, as an Asian American, and maybe as an Asian American Catholic especially. So I did a deep dive into the Boxer Rebellion, and what I found was absolutely fascinating. So like I said, the Boxer Rebellion was fought in the year 1900. It was fought on Chinese soil, and it is right in the middle of a period of Chinese history that the Chinese refer to as the century of humiliation. So back in the early 1800s, China had a certain conception of itself. The way you say China in Chinese is 中国. Those of you who speak Chinese, I apologize for my American accent, okay? I'm trying. But the way you say China in Chinese is 中国, and this literally translates to Middle Kingdom. And this is the way the Chinese thought of themselves at the beginning of the 1800s. They were not just the middle of the world, but the middle of the universe. China considered itself the lone superpower, militarily, economically, and culturally. Everyone inside of the kingdom was civilized, everyone outside was a barbarian. Then the 1800s rolled on. First came the Opium Wars in 1839, where Britain fought China for the right to sell drugs that were declared illegal by the Chinese government to the Chinese people. Unfortunately, China lost, and this was a devastating loss because up until this point, they had thought of the British as these barbarians from the West. Then came the Sino-French War in 1884. The French are notorious for being bad at winning wars. But they won this one. They won against China in 1884. And then came the Sino-Japanese War in 1894. Now, out of all of the wars that China lost during the 1800s, I think this one was probably the one that carried the most emotional weight. Because up until this point, in the relationship between these two countries, China had always seen itself as larger than Japan. Larger not just in landmass, but also culturally, economically, and militarily. Back in the day, the Japanese emperor actually had to send tribute every year to the Chinese emperor as a way of pledging allegiance. So to lose to a former tributary was just absolutely humiliating. At the beginning of the 1900s, many people all around the world were predicting that China would no longer be able to sustain itself as a unified nation. They thought China was going to break into pieces. So everybody wanted their peace. The Europeans and the Japanese all came into China looking for a peace. They established what were called concessions. These were areas in major Chinese cities that were under foreign control. Chinese citizens could not go in or out of these concessions without foreign permission. A little piece of their homeland no longer belonged to them. Humiliating. The Chinese government was unable to do anything about it. It was weakened by a century of war. So a group of young men in the countryside decided to take matters into their own hands. These young men led difficult lives. They were mostly uneducated. They were poor. They were starving. In addition to going through these wars, China had also gone through a series of devastating droughts, so all their crops were dead. These young men were hopeless, helpless, and angry. And here is where I find my connection with these young men who lived over a century ago. I am a comic book geek, and when we comic book geeks get hopeless, helpless, and angry, often what we do is we turn to the stories of our pop culture. We turn to the stories around us about heroes who were able to conquer their own self-doubts and even make the world a little bit better, right? And we feel inspired by these stories. These young men did the exact same thing. But unlike me, these young men did not have comic books or movies or television shows. What they did have were these springtime fairs. These fairs would feature traveling entertainers who would go from one village to the next during spring, performing, guys like this. This is a sword swallower from around that time. Now, out of all of the entertainers at these springtime fairs, the most popular were acting troupes who performed Chinese opera. China has a long tradition of opera, and when I looked into Chinese opera, I was struck by how similar this art form was to American comic books. Both Chinese opera and American comic books feature these heroes wearing colorful costumes with superpowers, fighting for the fate of the universe. So what do we geeks do? What do we comic book geeks do when we encounter these stories of heroes that we're inspired by in our comic books and in our movies and in our television sets? Well, we want to become them, right? We want to embody them. We do what these two people are doing. We make elaborate costumes and we try to embody them. We try to look like them. We try to tap into a little bit of those heroes' spirit. The young men from over a century ago had that same impulse, but they did not have the resources to create fancy uniforms. Instead, what they came up with was a ritual. This ritual involved controlling your breathing. It involved bowing a certain way. It involved burning up charms and eating the ashes. And they believed when they performed these rituals correctly, they could transform from ordinary farm boys into the operas, or the heroes of Chinese opera. They could call the heroes of legend down from heaven, and these heroes would possess their bodies and give them superpowers. I was absolutely fascinated by this whole dynamic, so I tried to illustrate it in Boxers and Saints. I'll have panels like this where I show both the young men in their normal farm boy form and also these young men in their god form. These young men, we refer to them as boxers now. They, after being empowered by these superpowers, they marched through the countryside fighting Europeans, Japanese, and their Chinese Christian allies. They were remarkably successful. They made it all the way to Beijing, to the capital of China, where there was a standoff over the summer between them and the European concessions. And it lasted several weeks before it was put down. These young men called themselves Yihe Chen, which roughly translates to righteousness, harmony, and fist. And that is why in the book, I refer to them as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. We refer to them as the Boxers whenever we talk about them within the context of Western history, because as they came into the major cities of China, their martial arts reminded Europeans who were there at the time of European boxing. I was so fascinated by this connection that I found between this old art form, Chinese opera, and this newer art form, American comic books, that I ended up doing some fan art that was inspired by this idea. So here is Chinese opera Thor, Chinese opera Hulk, Chinese opera Iron Man, and Chinese opera Captain America. I did not just find pop culture connections into the lives of the boxers. I also found them in the lives of their Chinese Christian enemies. Back then, in turn of the century China, if you converted to any form of Christianity, you were most likely somebody who was an outsider. You were most likely somebody who had a hard time finding a place for themselves in mainstream Chinese culture. A lot of early converts were women, or they were criminals, or they were the desperately poor. There are people who did not see reflections of themselves in the stories of their own culture. So what did? They turned to the stories of another culture. They turned to the stories that Western missionaries were bringing in, and they looked for reflections of themselves there. This idea of turning to another culture for your own identity reminded me of another corner of American geekdom. They reminded me of these folks right here. These are American fans of Japanese animation. Like I said, I worked at Bishop O'Dowd for a long time. There is an anime club there, and this definitely is not true of every member of the anime club. But some of those kids are young women and men who just had a hard time finding a place for themselves in mainstream American high school culture. So what do? They looked for their own reflection in the stories of another culture. They looked for their own reflection in stories of anime. I wanted to illustrate this dynamic in Boxers and Saints as well. So I have panels like this, where a young woman who eventually converts to a Western faith is inspired by a story from another culture. In this case, it's the story of Joan of Arc. As I was researching the Boxer Rebellion, I had a hard time deciding who the heroes were. I would read one book and I'd be like, the Boxers are definitely the heroes, right? They were defending their own culture against an invader. And then I would read another book and I'd be like, no, I think it was the Chinese Christians. They had this amalgamated sense of self and amalgamated identity, and all they wanted to do was wall up in their villages and survive this massacre. In the end, because of my indecision, the book turned into 2 volumes. So the good guys in one volume become the bad guys in the other. You have to know your past if you want to create a future. I did not know anything about the Boxer Rebellion until I started working on this book. When I was in high school, I think it maybe got covered by a paragraph in my high school history text. But the Boxer Rebellion and maybe the entire century of humiliation do loom large in Chinese conversations about Eastern and Western relationships. And I think it would do well for us to understand that. I think that our next century, our century in the future, will be defined by that relationship between East and West. And we have to make the effort to understand both sides of that relationship in order to move forward into the future. Okay, the next work that I want to talk about is Shang-Chi. So Shang-Chi is the Marvel Universe's greatest fighter. In 2019, I got a call from a Marvel editor named Darren Shan. He asked me to put in a proposal for a possible new Shang-Chi miniseries. He wanted to do 5 issues of Shang-Chi's stories. I have to say, in the beginning, I was a little bit hesitant, and I'm going to get into why in a second. But I first got to know Marvel in particular and superheroes in general when I was in the 5th grade, when I looked like this. One night when I was in 5th grade, my mom took me to our local bookstore, and she bought this comic for me off of a spinner rack. This is DC Comics Presents number 57, starring Superman and the Atomic Knights. I read this, and it blew my mind. Something about those drawings on those pages just did something inside my brain that had never been done before. So pretty soon after this, I became a full-fledged comic book geek. This was the beginning of my geekdom. I have to say, though, even though the very first comic in my collection was a DC comic, I very quickly became a Marvel fan. You all know this, right? In America, there are these 2 big superhero comic book companies. There's Marvel and DC. They have had a rivalry that has lasted for decades. Right now, I think we can all agree that Marvel is winning. When I was a kid, for whatever reason, I thought Marvel was just so much cooler than DC. You know, I remember finding out that there was a character in the DC universe named Aqualad, and I could not handle how dorky that was. Because Aqua by itself is kind of dumb. But when you add the word lad to it, it just doesn't seem like a name that is worthy of being a superhero name. So I was a huge Marvel fan. I loved all Marvel superheroes. I loved Spider-Man. I loved Captain America. I loved the Hulk. I even loved the dorky ones, like Jack of Hearts. No offense to Jack of Hearts fans. I loved them all except for one. I loved them all except for Shang-Chi. So Shang-Chi had a monthly series of his own that ran from the 70s into the early 80s. I started collecting comics in the mid to late 80s. So I would go to these comic book shops, and even though he didn't have his own monthly series, you could still find Shang-Chi comics in that shop. They were usually in the back issue bins or in the quarter bins, and I'd come across them every now and then. Every single time I came across a Shang-Chi comic, I would treat it like kryptonite. And I don't think I could have told you why when I was in 5th grade. But now looking back, I realized it had something to do with the fact that I hadn't come to terms with my own cultural heritage. You know, in 5th grade, that was when I started feeling uncomfortable. I started feeling embarrassed about the food that we ate at home, about the language that my parents spoke, about their accents, and about my own Chinese facial features. So something about picking up a comic book with a Chinese American superhero, bringing it up to the cash register, that would feel like I was highlighting all of the stuff about myself that I wanted to escape. So I never read a single Shang-Chi comic as a kid, despite being a huge Marvel fan. And looking back, I think that might have been a good thing, because those old Shang-Chi comics come from a much larger history of how American cartoonists and comic book artists have portrayed Chinese Americans, Asians, and Asian Americans. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is a political cartoon from the 1800s. So back then, in part because of a lot of the turmoil that we had talked about earlier that was happening in China, the droughts and the wars, many Chinese people immigrated to America. In fact, by the late 1800s, California was 10% Chinese immigrant. That's how many Chinese folks were here. All those immigrants started freaking out some corners of America. People were worried how all of these immigrants were going to change American culture. So pressure began to build on Congress to do something about it. Newspapers all over America started publishing images like this that featured exaggerated facial features of the Chinese immigrants, that featured a very simplified version of traditional Chinese clothing. And the purpose of these images were to dehumanize those Chinese immigrants so that Congress would act. And it worked. In 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which effectively ends all legal immigration from China to the United States for decades. This sort of imagery wasn't just limited to early political cartoons. It was also found in early American comic books. DC Comics, do you ever wonder what the D and the C stand for? DC Comics, the D and the C actually stand for Detective Comics, which is their oldest and most important and longest running monthly series. It's been running continuously every month since 1937. So the name of the company actually doesn't really make sense, right? It's like Detective Comics. But that's how important Detective Comics is. Detective Comics is best known as the birthplace of Batman, which is DC's most popular hero. But what a lot of people don't realize is, even comic book geeks, is that even though Batman began in Detective Comics did not begin with Batman. Batman doesn't show up until issue number 27, which is why if you go to like your attic and you find this somewhere, you could sell it and maybe buy half a house in California. That's how much this is worth. Now, for the first issue of Detective Comics, the publishers wanted to use a character that they felt like was much more marketable than any of the heroes that they had in their stable. This is what the cover of Detective Comics #1 looks like. The character on that cover is named Qin Lung, and he is what we refer to now as a yellow peril villain. This is arguably how Detective Comics, the company, birthed itself into the world, on the back of a yellow peril story. Qin Lung and all yellow peril villains back then were built on this idea that you could capitalize on the fear that that Americans had of the Chinese. And early comic books are replete with characters like this. The most egregious of these characters is probably this guy right here. This is Egg Fu. He is literally a man-sized yellow egg with a Fu Manchu mustache. And believe it or not, he is still around in the modern DC universe. This is what he looks like today. So both Qin Lung and Egg Fu are examples from the DC universe. Marvel also has its share of yellow peril villains, the most prominent of which is probably this guy right here. This is the Mandarin. He is basically Fu Manchu with 10 magic rings. He is an Iron Man nemesis. And he did even show up in the movies. In Iron Man 3, he was played by Ben Kingsley. They did tweak his story a little bit. Eventually, it was, of course, those of you who are Marvel Cinematic Universe fans know this. It was revealed that the Mandarin in Iron Man 3 was not the true Mandarin. He was actually an actor playing the Mandarin, an actor named Trevor Slattery. And we didn't actually meet the real Mandarin until 2021's Shang-Chi. Shang-Chi, when it was released, right before it was released, people were predicting that it was going to be a failure. I don't know if you remember this, but they thought that nobody was going to go out to the theaters to see it because of pandemic. Ultimately, it performed well above expectations, and it is one of the few pandemic-era movie hits that we have. A lot of that is because of this guy right here. This is Dustin Cretton. He is one of our most talented movie directors. He is an Asian American director, grew up in Hawaii, and before Shang-Chi, he was mostly making these heartfelt, small budget films. My favorite of his films was probably, up until Shang-Chi, was probably Just Mercy. And he took a lot of that sensibility and put it into a Marvel movie. I think that's why it works so well. If you are a fan of both Marvel movies and Marvel comics, you will probably notice that Dustin and his team took very little from the comic to put into their movies. I would argue that out of all of the heroes that have made that jump from the page onto the screen, all the Marvel characters, Shang-Chi took the least from the source material. And I think there's good reason for that. It's because Shang-Chi, a lot of that early stuff was pretty problematic. Shang-Chi debuted in Marvel Special Edition number 15, published in 1973. And it was so popular that he ended up taking over that book. So Marvel Special Edition became Master of Kung Fu, starring Shang-Chi. And the story behind his creation is this. In the 1970s, all of America was going through this collective obsession with Kung Fu, largely driven by the popularity of Bruce Lee. There was even a show on television called Kung Fu, where a white guy named David Carradine played an Asian immigrant, a Chinese immigrant. Marvel wanted to publish comic book tie-ins with David Carradine's Kung Fu show. So they went after the license, and they were unable to get it. So then they looked around and they thought, what other prominent IP is there that features a Chinese character? Not a lot, but they were able to find one, and that was Fu Manchu. So they acquired the license to Fu Manchu and started to produce Fu Manchu tie-in comics. Fu Manchu was created in 1913 by an author named Sax Rohmer. It was a series of incredibly popular and financially successful novels. The story of how Sax Rohmer created Fu Manchu is this. He and his wife were both artists. I think his wife was a performing artist, and he was a writer and a visual artist. And they were desperately poor, and they wanted to know how to make money. So what do you do when you're a creative person and you want to get some advice? You consult an Ouija board. So that's what they did. His wife and him got an Ouija board out, and they asked the Ouija board, how can I make a living? And the Ouija board spelled out the word Chinaman. Based on that word, he created Fu Manchu. Fu Manchu, the novels eventually inspire a series of films that are all incredibly successful. In the vast majority of these films, Fu Manchu is played by a white guy. So Marvel buys this license in the 1970s, and Fu Manchu is a villain, so they need a hero. So they create a brand new character, a character unique to the Marvel Universe. His name is Shang-Chi, and he is the son of Fu Manchu. The very first time I read these comics was after that Marvel editor called me and asked me to put together a proposal. So I started reading these old comics. That was when I was grateful that I had not read them when I was a kid. And what I discovered was this. First, I'm going to go over the good parts. I think a lot of those early, they're definitely a product of their time, but a lot of those early Shang-Chi comics really do show a lot of artistry. The primary artist of most of those issues is a guy named Paul Gulacy, who's rightfully considered a legend in American comics. And he brought in a lot of cinematic storytelling techniques to the medium of comics. This is an example. This is a face-off between Man-Thing and Shang-Chi. And you can see he uses these beautiful moment-to-moment transitions to up the tension. He does this here, too, in a scene where Shang-Chi is exploring the headquarters of a villain. He even pulled from non-comic book sources for inspiration for his art style. This, for example, this panel is inspired by graffiti art. And something else I really appreciated about these early Shang-Chi comics was that Shang-Chi was actually portrayed as a romantic lead. He got to kiss the girl, which almost never happens for Asian American male characters in Western media. But after reading all of these early Shang-Chi comics, I came away thinking the fundamental problem that I saw was that Shang-Chi did not follow the Marvel tradition of storytelling. Marvel, I think the reason why Marvel is so popular is because of the way it humanizes its characters. Before the Marvel explosion of the 1960s, superheroes were seen as people in the distance. They were seen as these gods. And what Marvel did was they brought these heroes close to us so that we could identify them, so that we can even imagine ourselves in their place. Spider-Man is the quintessential Marvel character, and we do see in his comics him doing all these super heroic feats, but we also see him doing his laundry. We also see him struggling to pay his bills. We see him taking care of his elderly aunt. He is a character that is meant to be identified with, not just looked at. When you read those early Shang-Chi comics, I would argue that Shang-Chi is not a character who is meant to be identified with. He talks very little. We don't get a ton of information about his interior life, about what he really wants and doesn't want. We don't really get a ton of information about his foibles, about his weaknesses. Really, I think the appeal of those early Shang-Chi comics is we were meant to look at how this crazy Chinaman did these crazy martial arts feats. He was not a character to be identified with. He was a character to be looked at. And the people that we were meant to identify with were his white supporting cast, right? We were supposed to stand alongside them and watch this crazy Chinaman do his crazy things. That's what the artists, I got to work with these amazing artists on these books, Marcus Tu and DK Ruan. Marcus, DK, and I, what we really wanted to do was we wanted to apply the Marvel method, the Marvel tradition of creating a character that you can identify with, and put that to test in Shang-Chi. So we did a few things. Number one is we gave him a regular job. We had him work at a bakery in San Francisco, Chinatown. And we also gave him a very complicated family that annoys him to no end, because all of us can identify with that, right? So in Shang-Chi, we gave him a supporting cast, not of British secret security officers, but of his own siblings. Because of fan support of Shang-Chi, originally I was expecting to only do 5 issues. We ended up doing a 24-issue run that just ended this week, the very last issue. Thank you. But it really was the support of the fans. We were kind of shocked that we were able to get that many issues. But the last issue came out just this past week. And I think Shang-Chi also typifies this idea that we got from Coach Liu, right? You have to know your past if you want to create a future. If you look at the past, especially if you look at the stories that are told about us in the past, how were we portrayed in American and in Western stories of the last century? And how do those stories inform what kind of stories we want to tell about ourselves in the future? Those are all questions that you have to ask yourself, and they're questions that can only be answered by looking at the past. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be here at the Asian Art Museum, because this is really an organization and a building that is dedicated to preserving the past. And I would argue that the reason why we want to preserve the past is because of the future. So after this talk, when you go around this museum and look at all of the amazing art displays, all of the amazing displays of history, I hope you don't just enjoy it, but I also hope that you ask the things that you're looking at, what they can teach you about the future. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So before we move to Q&A, I do want to share a preview with you. The book I'm probably most well known from is American Born Chinese, which came out in 2006. And I've had a media agent ever since the book was published, so over 15 years. But for a variety of reasons, nothing has ever worked out. Part of it was on my side, and part of it was on their side. On their side, up until very recently, I think there was just a lot of trepidation about creating an expensive piece of media like a movie or a television show with an Asian American protagonist. And then on my side, I talk about stereotypes in the book, and I was always kind of freaked out about how that portion of the book would be translated onto the screen. But 2 years ago, I got a call from Disney, and they said they did want to create an American-born Chinese television show for their streaming service, Disney+. And I have to say, the reason why they wanted to do it is because a guy named Dustin Cretton attached himself to the project. So it ended up happening. We spent the last year working on this show. They filmed for the first half of the year. The second half of the year was spent on post-production. At this time last year, we were still at the tail end of the casting process. I have to tell you, the fact that they were able to attract this cast is absolutely mind-blowing. So we have legends Michelle Yeoh and Ki Kwan. And the person who is arguably the handsomest man walking on planet Earth, Daniel Wu, is playing the Monkey King. Here is a photo from the first day of filming. It was on a high school baseball field. We did a good luck ceremony. So a substantial number of people on the cast are from the Hong Kong movie industry, and I guess this is a tradition there, so we did it here. So we did this thing where we burned incense and we ate pork. Ki Kwan fed me some pork. It was kind of surreal and amazing. Here is a photo of us at D23 earlier last year, promoting the series. So there's no firm date yet, but it will debut sometime in the first half of this year. I want to share with you a few photos from the set because I think this is an audience that will appreciate it. So the set was designed by these two Asian American set designers named Michelle Yeoh and Cindy Chow, and they poured their hearts into that set. They put in all these little details that I'm pretty sure the vast majority of viewers of that show are going to miss, but I want to show them to you right now. Here is what the television remotes look like in the living room set. Okay? Here's the kitchen counter. And here is the kitchen sink. So authentic to the very end. Authentic to the very end. All right, let me end with this, and then whatever questions you have, I'd be happy to answer it. I'd like to show you an in-production featurette that talks about how the show was made.
Jin, did you wear clean underwear?
Yeah, I did, Mom. What kind of a question is that? The American-Born Chinese is a show based on Luen Yang's graphic novel that explores culture and identity through the lens of adolescence.
We're twins. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of magic. There's a lot of badass action.
The show wants to be what we are, which is our own version of American.
Dude, welcome to rockstar status. This is pretty cool.
And we're adding a lot of characters that you would recognize if you watch Chinese movies.
And we've put together this pretty crazy dream team of creatives, both behind and in front of the camera.
Whoa! We're on Disney+, so it's like the home of these big, epic folk tales, from Cinderella to Little Mermaid, and the Monkey King in Chinese mythology is another one.
Do you know anything about the Monkey King?
Local? Everybody knows him.
We have the chance here to expand from the family to the superhero-ness of the Monkey King. With 8 episodes and a main character like Jin Wang,
Please don't say anything to make him mad.
their highs are your highs, and their lows are your lows. The heart of the show is this friendship.
Come on, throw me one.
It is a magical ride. And that's what Disney Plus is about, isn't it?
Thank you, everyone. So if I'm gonna draw as I answer questions. Hopefully my iPad will connect well. Let's see if it wants to cooperate. But does anyone have any questions that I can answer? Come on, buddy.
Yeah, we've got a few. Come over here. Person in the beret. Hold on. Hi.
Hi.
I'm so excited to like finally see you and like I don't know, just like be around this crowd of people. I see a lot of Asian Americans, which I'm really happy about. And I just want to say like I read American Born Chinese when I was like in high school. I'm 22 now, so that was like 4 years ago. And I remember reading Boxer and Saints, and it was definitely a part of history that I was never aware of. You know, I feel like a lot of just Chinese history, you know, I feel like kind of the main character of like American Born Chinese, especially grappling with, you know, being American, like Chinese American, and kind of like recognizing the stereotypes that, you know, unfortunately that we all have to face. And with the pandemic especially, I feel like a lot of resurgence of, you know, anti-Asian hate crimes have, you know, occurred. And, you know, it hurts me so much, you know, because I also lost a friend due to, you know, a hate crime. And there's just so much, I guess, history and a lot of just like impact that, you know, these creators, you know, like you, have on the Asian community. And I just wanted to ask you, you know, did you expect when writing the novel and, you know, writing, you know, the Shang-Chi comic books, I guess, the importance of, I guess, keeping like this kind of narrative alive, you know, having a place to point to where a lot of people can identify with these characters, you know, these kind of Asian American struggles where we can't quite identify with, you know, our immigrant parents, or where we can't quite identify with Western culture either. You know, we always feel like we're stuck in between. And especially, I don't know, I was someone who was born and raised in San Francisco, and very thankful for that. But at the same time, it's like, oh my God, I realize you know, if it weren't for my family history, I would have never gotten a chance to even like learn the language English, which is my primary language. And I don't know, I guess to you, you know, like knowing how many people feel like they identify with this novel as much as it did with me, did you expect this kind of impact?
I did not expect anything like this. Like, even this is kind of stunning. I'm sitting in the Asian Art Museum talking to you all. It's stunning. American Born Chinese, I started working on it in the year 2000. And I was doing it as mini comics, which meant I would write and draw an issue. I would take it to my local Kinko's, remember Kinko's? And I would run off copies, staple it by hand, and sell them to like my friends and my mom, you know? So if I sold like 16 copies, I'd be happy about it. So to go from there to here has been absolutely stunning. I mean, I think some of it is, I was just lucky in terms of timing. So I think I was working at a time when the American graphic novel was kind of experiencing a renaissance. You know, a lot of the most celebrated graphic novels have been produced over maybe the last 15 years. So I was just lucky to be a part of that, you know. And it was in a time when like librarians and teachers all knew what a graphic novel was. I also do think that in terms of Asian America, I think we're in a time right now where we are defining what it means to be an Asian American. I think when I look at my parents, they were primarily concerned with like surviving in the country, right? And because of that, because of the sacrifices they made, I can think about the next step, which is, what does it mean? Like, what is an authentically Asian American expression of art and of music and of stories? So I think a lot of it is just luck of timing. I just feel incredibly fortunate.
Hello. Hey, Gene, super big fan of Meet You, man. I've been a fan actually since like 2007. I went to SF State and I took an Asian American Studies class, and American Born Chinese was on the curriculum. So that was very cool, man. And I'll even say, as someone, I'm Latino, and I even identified with a lot of the stuff that you talked about in that book, a lot of the themes. So major shout out for that. One of the things I'm curious about, oh, also too, I never see you in any Comic Cons, man. I go to everyone and I'm like, Is Gene gonna be there? Is Gene? So I came all the way here to the art museum just to see you, man. So what I want to ask about is one of your more recent comics to come out from DC, which is Monkey Prince. So how did that come along? Because right now, it's hard to get new characters out. It's hard to get new titles going. And when I saw this book come out from you, and of course, your artist collaborators as well, I was like, where did this come from? How did this come to be? And of course, I bought it. But can you tell us a little bit about how that book came to be?
Yeah, well, first, thank you. Thank you. I apologize for the homework that you had to do in that class because of my book. But thank you. And I promise I'm going to be going to Comic-Cons again soon. I actually went to WonderCon this past year. And it was much smaller than normal, but it felt really good to be back in a con environment. Monkey Prince, thank you for reading that book. It's actually, that was the brainchild of Jessica Chen, who is an editor at DC Comics, and she, for a very long time, has been wanting to, have more Asian American superheroes in the DC universe. So she did. She ended up putting together an anthology called The Festival of Heroes from DC Comics, and that's where Monkey Prince debuted. She, just like me, and just like almost any other kid of Chinese descent, grew up with the Monkey King, and we've always wanted to bring the Monkey King's legend into one of the superhero universes, right? Like there's a lot of mythology in those superhero universes. Norse mythology produced Thor, which is a huge player in the Marvel universe. Wonder Woman on the DC side is really tied into Greek mythology, and we just wanted some Chinese, like Asian mythology in general. In Chinese culture, Monkey King, it just looms so huge, he felt like a natural place to start. So it really was her efforts. Monkey Prince in DC, he is the son of the Monkey King, but he is also adopted by these professional hench people. So his mom and his dad, his adoptive mom and his dad, they just travel from one DC city to the next working for these different supervillains. So in the beginning, they're working for Penguin, and then they go and work for Black Manta, and now in our most recent storyline, they're working for Ultra Humanite. If you're a DC fan or if you're a fan of Chinese mythology, I hope you'll check it out. The story's all right. The art is amazing. The art is amazing. The art is done by Bernard Chang, who is a straight up legend in American comics. If you haven't checked out Bernard's stuff, man, it's stunning. Yeah, thank you.
How do you produce work that is authentic to yourself and not necessarily subject to the marketing tropes or fetishization of Asian American culture? I feel at times that some Asian American works can be a little bit on the nose, whereas, for example, No No Boy, which was published in the 1950s, felt very fresh and refreshing and authentic. So yeah, really curious. Thank you.
Yeah. I read No No Boy last year as well. It was amazing. It was mind blowing. I think first when I started in comics, it was in the 90s, and I think a lot of people were expecting American comics to fall apart. I remember going to places like Comic-Con. It was a ghost town. Nowadays you have to buy tickets months in advance, but back then you did not because nobody was going. And I would go to these panels and I would listen to my favorite artists and authors and publishers talk about how we were going to see the death of the American comic book because no one was buying comics. And that's how I kind of started in comics. I went in thinking, I'm never going to make a living at this. I'm just going to do it for fun. Some people, more than fun, like for meaning, right? Some people spend lots of money playing golf. I'm going to spend lots of money making comics and self-publishing. So when you are working in that mindset, and I also got really lucky because I fell in with like this group of Bay Area cartoonists who all also were terrible with money, you know? And we all used to like hang out together. So I think when you go in with that mindset, you are less, like when you don't have to rely on your art to feed yourself, and that's how you start, you are less aware of what the trends even are. It's more just about you wanna, like you're doing it because you have something you have to say or you feel like you're gonna die, right? So you do it. So since then, like I was very reluctant to go full-time at comics for a variety of reasons. I finally did in 2015. One of the reasons was because of that, because I was like worried about like having to feed my family with comics, right? So I have to say, I feel the pressure now that I'm full-time and now that it's my primary income. But I try to remember what it felt like back then. And I try to write my stories from that feeling from back then. But great question.
Someone over here. There was someone in here. Yes, oh, hold on.
Hi, I was just wondering if you also like interacted with like other Asian American comic like creators on like Instagram, because that's kind of like the new way to do it now, right? Like instead of like taking it to Kinko's and like printing it out, like that's how they get their art out there.
Yeah.
And if you ever use like your position as someone who is established to try to like find those creators and connect them to the right people, because I imagine it might be a little harder now because there is so much content being created.
Yeah, there is a lot of content being created. Like I said, I was lucky that I fell in with a group of creators who were all terrible with money in the 90s and early 2000s. That's kind of the crew. Like we were all in our 20s. We were all starting off in comics. Nobody really seemed to care about money that much. People just wanted to tell stories that were personal to them. And and a lot of us were Asian Americans. So Derek Kirk Kim was part of that. He did a classic comic called Same Difference. He's here somewhere too. And Tin Pham was a part of that, who has a book called Family Style coming out. And Lark Pian, who ended up coloring American Born Chinese. And I think that was kind of my crew, right? That's how I learned how to make comics, was by hanging out with them. These days, I know artists tend to go directly onto the web. I have to be honest, I still am confused by Instagram. I still don't totally understand what that little like paper arrow, like a paper airplane thing means and how to use it or anything like that. So I have a hard time connecting with people on Instagram. But I do feel like a connection into an artistic community is incredibly important. So the way I've done it recently is, for a very long time I taught, until last year I taught at Hamlin University. I taught as part of an NFA program, so I got to hang out with all of these amazing storytellers. They were mostly novelists and poets. I was one of just a handful of graphic novel people there. But with my fellow teachers and my students, I think that's kind of how I kept that sense of community alive. If you want to give me Instagram tips, I'm totally open, because that, honestly, I still feel confused.
Thank you for making our community visible, and thank you for a lot of different states now making AAPI as part of ethnic studies. I'm actually curious in terms of what your goal might have been to be a cartoonist, and do you actually foresee a lot of this content sort of cross over really to the larger community in America to be more accepting of Asians?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, my goal was really to produce a graphic novel. I graduated from college with a degree in computer science, and I realized if I did not publish a comic before I died, I would die unfulfilled. So in the beginning, it was just about that. It was, I want to do a comic book. I want to do a graphic novel. I want it to be about something that is important to me. And from then on, it was like everything after that was kind of icing, Like it was just about getting the book out in the beginning. I think, like I said earlier, I do think I feel lucky to be a part of comics at this time, and also to be a part of Asian America at this time. Like if you look around, we are finally kind of finding our voice, right? We're finally kind of finding what we're about and who we are in the larger context of America. I feel grateful to be a part of that. I do think that what you're seeing right now is not just a larger acceptance of Asian American stories, but a larger identification with Asian American stories. I think more and more non-Asian readers and viewers are able to find some overlap between their experience and the stories that we're telling on the page and on the screen. I think that's great.
Hello.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I'm not used to speaking on a microphone. I don't want to speak too much about myself because I'm here with you. And that's what I appreciate so much I appreciate being in this room listening, absorbing, and being with everyone in here. I am maybe somewhat appearing like the awesome basketball coach, someone who looks like they'd be sitting at a different table, and is myself not a history expert, but a fan. I know what the Boxer Rebellion, I already was familiar with the Boxer Rebellion. I was already familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And you, sir, have delivered those stories to me today, newly. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's really nice of you to say. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I think we have time for one more. So hold on, let me get you. I'm gonna come through here. See, you've had your hand up.
Sorry, I think that's
Hi, thank you so much for being here. That was a really fantastic talk. I was just curious what the experience is like being a MacArthur genius. Did you have any kind of like heads up beforehand, or is it a complete surprise? Are there like genius parties? You get to hang out with the other geniuses, or and what did you end up doing with that grant money? Did you use it for a dedicated project, or is it just money?
Yeah, that was a crazy experience. So the MacArthur Foundation gives out these grants of over $500,000 to different people, and I was driving to work. I was gonna go work at a Panera that day, and I was driving to the Panera, and then I get this call from an unrecognized number in the Chicago area. I usually don't pick up unrecognized numbers because they're always trying to sell me something, but I did for whatever reason that day. And then it's the MacArthur Foundation telling me they're gonna give me this grant. And that was the end of my workday. I could not do any more work after that because I was so like flabbergasted. I called my wife, and I don't know if she totally believed me the first time I told her, but it's been stunning. So one of the crazy things about that whole program is that I think they give 12 to 15 grants at a time. And then those people all can gather together for a retreat in the Chicago area. And then we share about our work. So I went to this retreat, and then you're invited to give a talk about your work. So I did. I gave a talk about Chinese Superman, which I was working on at the time for DC Comics, and American-born Chinese and a few other things. And then after me, this dude gave a talk about how he's working on a way of converting carbon emissions back into usable fuel. So that's what it felt like. That's what I'm not giving the money back, right? But that's what it felt like. But I've been grateful. Like the things that have the MacArthur money has helped with is, number one, I don't go to Panera to work anymore. I actually work in a workspace. So I used to, like at Panera, every time I would go to the bathroom, I would have to carry my laptop with me, and now I can just leave it on the desk and go to the bathroom. And then second, we have 4 kids, and it does help with paying for their college.
Thank you so much, Jean. This was illuminating and funny.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here.